You received a letter from the government and they're taking your property. What now? Involuntary conversions of real estate, such as eminent domain or natural disasters, do not have to end badly. Let's unravel that mystery today on Go Ahead Ask.
Building wealth in real estate? Let the Exeter Group take the mystery out of how it's done on Go Ahead Ask.
Welcome to Go Ahead Ask podcast by the Exeter Group, where we try to unravel the mystery of investment real estate. Our objective is to provide investors with better quality information and education so they can make better informed investment decisions. I'm Bill Exeter, Chief Executive Officer of Exeter 1031 Exchange Services, and I'll be your host today. Exeter Group of Companies includes Exeter 1031 Exchange Services, which is a qualified intermediary for 1031 exchange transactions. And we administer all types of 1031 exchanges in all 50 states. We're also one of the few qualified intermediaries that will administer 1031 exchanges of foreign property. The Exeter Group of Companies also includes Exeter Trust Company. Exeter Trust Company serves as custodian for self-directed IRAs and individual 401k plans, as trustee for title holding trusts or land trusts, as escrow agent for specialty holding escrows, and we provide general custody services. As always on Go Ahead Ask, we encourage your questions and comments and topics. So if you have a question, if you have a topic you'd like us to cover, email us at ask@exeterco.com. Again, that is ask@exeterco.com. Or you can call us at area code 619-239-3091. If you love Go Ahead Ask, please let us know, like it, subscribe to it, share it, and comment on it. We will address and answer questions and comments on all of our podcast episodes. Today's podcast is entitled Unraveling the Mystery of 1033 Exchanges. So you received a letter from the government and they're going to take your real property via eminent domain. Or perhaps your property was fully or partially destroyed through a natural disaster, such as a fire, flood, tornado, hurricane, mudslide. Now what? How does this affect you from a tax perspective? What are your options? Well, these are considered involuntary conversions of real estate, and it's either through an eminent domain action or it's through a natural disaster, and they don't have to end badly. And actually, in some cases, they can put you in a much better position. So we're going to unravel the mystery today on Go Ahead Ask. Now let's unravel the mystery of 1033 exchanges. First, it's considered an involuntary conversion. What is that exactly? So an involuntary conversion is when your property is either taken from you, we call it a taking, or it was destroyed through a natural disaster. Like I said before, fire, flood, hurricane, tornado, etc. There's a lot of planning opportunities here. So first, before you panic, realize that there are ways to work around this. Don't just give in if it's an eminent domain. Keep in mind that the government can take your property for all sorts of reasons, but it has to be something for the quote unquote public good. And with that, it might be to widen a freeway. It might be for a public school. It might be for a civic or county office facility. But in any event, they're taking the property for the public good. And in many cases, they will prepare perhaps 3 different appraisals, the low, the middle, and the high. And they're obviously going to offer you the low, and they realize that most people just give in and take whatever they're offered. So it's important for you to make sure that you're represented by legal counsel so that you can make sure you negotiate and try to get a higher offer, which is quite likely. Next, we want to look at what are the consequences. So an involuntary conversion, whether it's a natural disaster or if it's an eminent domain, is considered a sale for tax purposes. So let's take a natural disaster first. You have a natural disaster such as a fire, flood, hurricane, tornado, what have you. Your property is partially or fully destroyed. You file an insurance claim with your company. They evaluate the claim and then cut you a check, and you get a check, the proceeds from your insurance policy. that's considered basically sale proceeds, as if you partially sold the property. And if you do nothing with it, it's a taxable event. Now, most people take the proceeds from their insurance company and they'll rebuild or repair the property. And that's a 1033 exchange. They have reinvested by repairing the property. The other side of the coin is an eminent domain action. Some people call it a condemnation, where the government, either city, county, state, or federal government, comes in and condemns or takes your property through an eminent domain action. It could be in a number of different ways. It could negotiate with you. It could be an actual court proceeding, but they actually take the property. And that's also considered a sale for tax purposes. So how do we address that? Well, it all falls under Section 1033 of the tax code. It allows you to defer the taxes that would be triggered under this type of a sale. So whether it's an eminent domain action or whether it's a natural disaster, you can structure a tax deferred exchange under Section 1033 of the Internal Revenue Code. And that means you're reinvesting the proceeds so that you do not pay the federal and state taxes today. You're deferring the taxes by doing the 1033 exchange transaction. So with an involuntary conversion, if it's a natural disaster, you receive your proceeds from the insurance company and you repair the property you have reinvested. Now, most investors don't realize they've actually done a 1033 exchange in that case. Most of them probably don't report it, but technically you've had an involuntary conversion. You have reinvested your proceeds through the repair process, so it should be reported as a 1033 exchange on your tax return. Through an eminent domain action, it's the same scenario. It's an involuntary conversion. Your property has been taken from you by the government, and they're compensating you from that taking. The taking might be a partial exchange, maybe, or partial taking. Maybe they've taken just a sliver or side of your property to widen a freeway. But in any event, it's either a partial or a full involuntary taking. With that, the proceeds can be reinvested through a 1033 exchange transaction. So whether it's a natural disaster or an eminent domain action, it can be deferred through the 1033 exchange. So let's talk about how we structure that. And then at the very end, we'll get into some planning opportunities you might have with this type of an involuntary conversion. So the first thing is most of you are probably aware of a 1031 exchange, which is what we administer here at Exeter 1031 Exchange Services. The process is different, but the end result is the same with a 1033 exchange. You're deferring the payment of your taxes at the federal and the state level. So the first thing to note, and these are some of my favorite things about a 1033 exchange, is one, there is no provision for a third party to hold the cash proceeds. If your property is taken through an eminent domain action and you're compensated by the government, you could take the cash, you could put it in your bank account, doesn't have to be held by anyone except for you, and you can do anything you want with those proceeds as long as you reinvest before the end of the deadline, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there's no provision, and actually there's no real ability for a third party to hold those cash proceeds. You could certainly have someone hold them if you want to keep them separate and make sure you don't goof and spend them. But in most cases, you just take them, put them in your own bank account, etc. We're going to take a short commercial break here for a message from our sponsor.
This episode is sponsored by our sister company, Exeter Trust Company. Did you know that all individual retirement accounts are self-directed IRAs? It's because you choose where to put them. You choose whether to put your self-directed IRA at a bank or at a securities or brokerage firm or a life insurance company. So that makes it self-directed. But did you also know that all IRA custodians are not created equal? Most IRA custodians, like the banks, the securities firms, and the life insurance companies, limit you to publicly traded investments such as stocks and bonds and mutual funds. But some IRA custodians, like Exeter Trust Company, allow investors to invest their IRA funds in other alternative assets such as real estate. Investors can acquire real estate, mortgages, deeds of trust, or tax lien certificates inside the IRA as an investment inside the IRA. To learn more, call Exeter Trust Company at area code 307-222-8888 8750 or visit them on the internet at exetertrustcompany.net.
And we're back to unravel the mystery of 1033 exchanges today. So we were talking about the fact that you don't have to have a third party to hold the cash proceeds or anything like that. When the closing occurs from this eminent domain action and your property is taken and you receive these cash proceeds, you just deposit them in your own bank account. So the next topic we should cover is, what do you have to do to reinvest that? What are the requirements? What's the structure like? So the first issue I usually bring up is qualified use and like-kind property. The definitions here are different than they are in the 1031 exchange world, and it depends on the type of involuntary conversion. So first, let's start with the natural disaster. If your property is either partially or fully destroyed, let's just assume it's fully destroyed from a natural disaster, you receive your insurance proceeds, and now you want to reinvest. And you decide, I'm not going to rebuild the property. It's just a total loss. I still own the dirt, but the building and the structures, everything's gone. I think I'm just going to go buy another property. But what can I buy? What's considered qualified use? What is considered like-kind property? Well, in the 1031 exchange world, it's very broad. But in the 1033 exchange world, it's not always that broad. So for a natural disaster, it's actually pretty specific, pretty narrow. And they use the definition or the term similar or related in service or use. So for the most part, if you have, let's say, multifamily property, where maybe it's a single family or a multifamily, you've got tenants, you rent the property out to them, et cetera, you pretty much have to reinvest in something that's also a single family or multifamily property that's residential that you're leasing out to tenants. If it's a commercial office structure, you've got tenants, you probably want to go with the commercial office structure. You might be able to get away with other types of property that also have tenants in it, but you're looking at the similar or related in service or use. That's probably too much of a risk to go from something like a multifamily property and then buy dirt, because it's the similar or related in the service or use is very, very different in that case. So we want to look at that. The second, like kind, is actually the same. You're selling real estate, you have to buy real estate. So it's really that qualified use that we want to look at. Now, if you're in the eminent domain category, it's not quite, but it's very similar to the definition of qualified use and like kind for 1031 exchange treatment. There's more flexibility and you can reinvest in other types of real estate, and it's not quite that similar or related in service or use. So we're getting pretty darn close to the definition of qualified use under Section 1031 exchange. So we use that kind of as a guideline. The challenge here is that there's very little guidance on 1033 exchanges. There's very few court decisions out there and very few audits and rulings and what have you. So there is a lot of gray area that leaves a lot of questions open for interpretation. So one of the things I want to cover here is when you're looking at the qualified use requirement, and if you're under the natural disaster where it's that similar or related in service or use, and you're looking to reinvest, if you want to do something that is different than what you lost through the natural disaster, you might want to look at, is there a way to sell the property and do a 1031 exchange? The same as under an eminent domain. This probably applies more to the eminent domain world. Your property is taken from you, and you're looking at this thing, okay, I lost a multifamily property. I'd really like to reinvest in farmland or ranchland or timberland, which is very different than what was taken from you. In that case, you may say, okay, let's take a look at the 1031 exchange instead. If I can negotiate with the government agency and sell it to them with a regular purchase and sale agreement, perhaps we can do this and do a 1031 exchange so I get a broader definition of like-kind property. So that's one of the things you want to take a look at there. We're going to talk about the deadlines in a minute. With a 1033 exchange, your deadlines are much longer. You have a lot more time to reinvest, things like that. But you've got that more strict definition of qualified use and like-kind property. So you have to kind of decide which is the better way to go for you. Do you want a shorter time frame with a 1031 exchange? Do you want a longer time frame but a much narrower definition of qualified use? In most cases, I think people are going to probably go with the 1033 exchange because of the longer time frames. So let's talk about the time frames. With deadlines, in the 1031 world, you have 45 days to identify what you're going to acquire. You have an additional 135 days to complete your 1031 exchange for a total of 180 calendar days. In the 1033 world, you have anywhere from 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years to reinvest. So typically, if it's a natural disaster, you have 2 years. If it's an eminent domain, you have 3 years. If it's your primary residence, you generally have 4 years. And it's not unheard of. It's actually not, I wouldn't say common, but it's not too difficult to get an extension of time in the 1033 exchange world, where you can get an extension so you have a total of 5 years to reinvest. And let me be specific on how that works. Let's assume that today we're in June of 2021, and let's assume today the property is taken through an eminent domain. You actually have the rest of 2021, and then you have the 3-year window. So you'd have 2022, 23, and 24. So your deadline in an eminent domain transaction would be December 31st of 2024. So you'd actually have about 3.5 years to complete this eminent domain 1033 exchange. If it's a natural disaster, you'd have all of 2021. You have 2022 and 2023. So your deadline would be December 31st of 2023, et cetera. So it's probably more than the 2, the 3, 4, or 5-year deadline, depending on your scenario. Again, it's very important to have tax counsel here to lead you through this to make sure that you follow all the requirements and you're in compliance with everything. And it's relatively easy to follow these requirements because you have so much time, but it's important to make sure that you keep on top of them. Now that we've covered the deadlines, let's talk about the reinvestment requirements. And this is kind of my favorite part of the 1033 exchange, because the only requirement is to make sure that you buy or reinvest of equal or greater value. To compare and contrast that with a 1031 exchange, you have to buy equal or up in value, so equal or greater. You have to reinvest all your cash proceeds, so all the equity that comes out of your sale transaction, and then generally you replace the debt, et cetera, in order to defer all of your taxes. In the 1033 exchange world, that's not the case. All you have to do is buy a property that is worth equal or greater than what was taken from you. So if you had $1 million asset taken through eminent domain, whether you buy 1 or buy 2 or buy 3 replacement properties, as long as that total value is equal to or greater than $1 million, it doesn't matter how you pay for that. So you could, in theory, pocket all of your cash, get 100% financing. Obviously, that's not practical, but if you could pull that off, you've reinvested at $1 million or greater. That would qualify for full tax deferred exchange treatment under Section 1033. There's no requirement that you reinvest all or any of the cash proceeds that come out of the eminent domain action. So that's one of my favorite things. You can actually pull cash out of this structure without incurring any tax liability, which is very different than what would happen with a 1031 exchange. If you pull cash out in a 1031 exchange, the term is cash boot, and it's taxable whether you like it or not. So that's kind of a very quick overview of the requirements for a 1033 exchange transaction. Now let's talk about some of the planning opportunities. In a lot of cases, we'll get phone calls from clients who say, I am selling my property to a government agency. And so one of the questions we'll ask is, well, is it a government agency that has eminent domain authority? And in a lot of cases, the answer is yes. And it's like, this is going to sound really funny, but have you thought of asking them to threaten you with eminent domain action? It's probably one of the few areas where you actually want the government to threaten you. Because to qualify for a 1031 exchange, the government either actually has to proceed with the eminent domain action and actually take your property. That means they usually go to court, they sue, and they go through the process, they win, and the court grants them the eminent domain action, and they take your property and they pay for it. But if you're negotiating or have already negotiated the sale of the property with a government agency, you could go to them and say, would you threaten me? You could build it into the purchase and sale agreement that says, if you as the seller fail to close on this sale, if you fail to convey title to the agency, if you fail to close for any reason, the agency is going to take your property through eminent domain. They could put it on the letterhead and say, we've agreed to buy your property. However, if you fail to close, if you fail to sell this property to us, we are going to take your property through eminent domain. That's a threat. And that means you qualify for 1033 exchange treatment. So even if they don't go through the eminent domain process and they don't go to court and file an eminent domain action, but they threaten you, you could still qualify for 1033 exchange treatment. Now, it's important to note that it has to be a threat. If they just mention it and say, we're considering or we're thinking about this, chances are that's not going to be interpreted as a threat. So you want it to be very specific that if you fail to close, you fail to sell, we're going to take your property through eminent domain. And by doing that, it allows you to qualify for the 1033 exchange. And that actually gives you a lot of planning opportunities in structuring your transaction. It gives you more time to find replacement property. It gives you the ability to pull some cash out if you want to do that. So it's actually not a bad thing. A lot of times clients will call and they say, oh my God, I'm going through an eminent domain, they're taking my property, and it's obviously stressful. You didn't really want it to happen. But in the long run, on a financial basis, it might actually be very good for you. It just depends on the scenario. But this is just kind of a quick overview for 1033 exchanges to give you a flavor for how they work. And if you're having a property taken, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't have to end up in a bad way. It actually can be really good if you sit down and kind of plan around it. So that's kind of it for the 1033 exchange. Thank you for listening today for Go Ahead Ask podcast by the Exeter Group. Our last episode, we had a little fun with it. We changed the name. It wasn't Unraveling the Mystery. It was called Staying Alive in Your 45. It was really designed to help investors that are either coming up on or are in the middle of their 45-day identification period for a 1031 exchange. So we had a little fun with that, and we were really discussing options, strategies, and most importantly, what replacement property options might be available to you. We go into some options you might not think about. So maybe you go back and look at the episode for Staying Alive in Your 45. And along the same lines, our next episode is going to be exit strategies for highly appreciated real estate. We're going to talk about strategies. We'll talk about different types of properties that qualify under the qualified use and the like kind requirement and things you might want to look at. This is all designed to help you plan for exiting the real estate. When you're ready to sell, what are your options? What can you do? So take a look at Staying Alive in Your 45. Take a look at our next episode coming up next week, because both of them will help you plan and prepare for that 45-day identification period, which can be extremely stressful. So as always, at Go Ahead Ask, we encourage questions and topics, so feel free to call us or email us. You can email us at ask@exeterco.com or call us at 619-239-3091. Or if you have a topic you want us to cover, just shoot us an email. Or perhaps if you have a topic that you're an expert in, let us know. We'd love to have you on the podcast. If you love the podcast, please let us know. Share it, like it, subscribe to it, comment on it, and we will address any comments or questions, and we appreciate that. Again, thank you for joining us on Go Ahead Ask by Exeter, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Go Ahead Ask with the Exeter Group. Join us for our next episode when we further unravel the mysteries of real estate.